Okay, so this evening is the Vesakha Puja, full moon of May, and is the traditional commemoration of the Buddha's birth, enlightenment, and his passing away. So this is a day of recollecting the Buddha. And there's many, many ways that one can be recollecting the Buddha, but I think one of the important aspects to bring to mind is when we think of the refuges. Of course, the first refuge is the Buddha, and oftentimes, say in traditional Buddhist cultures, when one introduces people to meditation, generally the one doesn't begin by teaching mindfulness of breathing or giving a vipassana technique. One begins by recollecting the Buddha. The Buddha is central to the whole. Central to Buddhism. I mean, it's pretty clear. It's pretty clear by the name Buddhism that it's Buddha had something to do with it, and so that to truly bring to mind the memory, the meaning of the Buddha, and to establish a heart of faith, of confidence, of trust, of devotion. It's like the opening oneself to the possibility of the Buddha's awakening is so important. It's like one of the early utterances of the Buddha on his own awakening. It's sort of the doors to the deathless are open. For those who have ears to hear, who open their hearts to that possibility. You think that, you think in those terms, the doors to the deathless are open. So what the Buddha has done is pointed the way, pointed the direction, and is also the say the witness or the verification that this path does take one to awakening, to freedom from suffering, freedom from dukkha. To be bringing to mind the recollection of the Buddha in one of the meditations that is very common is Buddhanusati, the recollection of the Buddha. And it's the first. There's a set of meditations that are called protective meditations, and recollection of the Buddha is the first protective meditation. that we can undertake, and it has this quality of protecting, nurturing, laying the root of all good things in the practice. So just to because oftentimes it's not in say in the West, it's not really talked about that much. There tends to be much more technique, method, taken an interest in, both in terms of samatha, in terms of the tranquility, peace of the mind, so the development of mindfulness of breathing, or the insight and wisdom practices and reflections of impermanence, unsatisfactory, not self, or dependent origination. But this one has to reflect and consider, well, what ground, what basis does this grow from? Because if it's just a nice idea, I should make my mind peaceful, and I need to make my mind think of impermanence, unsatisfactoriness, not self. But it's that quality of confidence and trust in the awakening of the Buddha and the example that the Buddha set that is actually such a huge catalyst for of all the wholesome dhammas that can arise, all the skillful qualities that we can cultivate. So the different ways of recollecting the Buddha. I mean, some of it is, we're talking at tea time about like visualizations, using and taking a Buddha image that one feels particularly drawn to, and evokes a certain feeling of those wholesome qualities of the Buddha, or peace, of the compassion, the wisdom, awakening quality. I mean, you notice with all, virtually every Buddha image that is made, created, carved, cast, they all have their eyes open. If even just a little bit, looking down, but awake, and not, and of course, the posture upright, kind of a sort of bold or alert kind of a posture, not tense or tight or slumped or drifting. So that and that's one of the primary meanings of the word Buddha, is awake or awakened. That being an awakening to the true nature of the world around one, awakening to the true nature of the world inside, of the heart itself. So attending to this quality of awakening. in the traditional chants that we do when we recollect the Buddha, there's the recollections of again, these different qualities, 9 particular qualities. And it's that itipisopa, and then the chant itipisopa kawa. Arahang is the first quality. Arahang is it's a word that was around in the time of the Buddha, and it was used to denote someone who was enlightened. I think its primary meaning is noble, but the particular meaning that the Buddha used and has been passed on from the early days of Buddhism is that it's pointing noble because of the freedom from defilement, freedom from attachment. And usually, like in the Thai language, when it's translated, it's translated as far from defilement, so that the mind has moved beyond the entangled attachments and moods that are tainted by greed, hatred, and delusion. So that that's why there's a noble quality, because the heart has moved beyond, is far from defilement. Samma sambuddho is the quality of, rightly self-awakened, where when the Buddha was awakened through his own efforts, through his own motivation, and was able to see and penetrate truth without relying on others. He didn't have a model. That was one of the things that he didn't find an awakened being. Didn't find one. He was one who brought this teaching into being. This opening up the path for others to follow. And that's extremely special and extremely difficult. But it's also a testament to the Buddha's wisdom and discernment, his ability to reflect, investigate, and penetrate truth. And so when we recollect the Buddha, just this tremendous, in my mind, my heart, this tremendous gratitude that there was somebody like a Buddha, even if it was 2,500 years ago, able to point out the truth, and this truth still being accessible today. This is a fundamental truth of a way to awakening and liberation is not something that is, say, bound by time. That's the nature of when we do the recollection of the Dhamma. It's one of the recollections, as it's akaliko. It's not bound by time. It isn't that, the truth was like that during 2,500 years ago, but it's a different truth now. Conditions are different, but the fundamental truth of how we suffer and how we can be free from suffering is exactly the same. The human habits, human heart really hasn't changed all that much. And the Buddha was able to really see through that. That vicācarana sampanno, perfect in knowledge and conduct. And those two qualities are really important in the sense that, it's one thing to have knowledge and understanding and have a, say, intelligent analysis of the world around one or of one's own being, but then to actually act on it skillfully, to act on it perfectly. Sampanno was like, vicācarana sampanno, it's like complete, replete, full. So that's kind of rare. To actually manifest those one's knowledge, because we can see for ourselves. I mean, there's all sorts of things we see we would like to do or like to be, but it's so easy to fall short or to miss the whole picture, and end up tripping ourselves up or getting caught in some kind of quagmire of conditions around us. So that the Buddha was able to really integrate that understanding, knowledge, and his conduct, behavior. When we recollect the Buddha, sometimes it's easy to, and certainly in Buddhist history, the kind of reification of the Buddha, putting him on this incredible pedestal and making him almost divine, is fairly ordinary and as a human tendency, but as something the Buddha himself really didn't try to do. It was during his own time. Like there's a sutta where the King Ajatasattu comes to pay respects to the Buddha, and his father, King Ajatasattu's father, was King Bimbisara, and King Bimbisara was a very faithful and devoted disciple of the Buddha. He was a stream enterer, and so had some realization, and an exceedingly good person and a good ruler. And his son was jealous and ambitious and killed him. But he had some remorse and some, and he went to see the Buddha, and of course he's somebody who has lived unskillfully, done unskillful things in their life. One of the things they experience is fear, and so that King Ajatasattu trying to go into the presence of the Buddha is hesitant, fearful, and it's at night, and there's a huge sangha around and people, and so he keeps hesitating, and then he sees the assembly of the sangha, and it's not clear to him who the Buddha is, because the Buddha isn't up there with his, 7-color aura radiating in all directions, and he looks like anybody else. He's in front and center, but he's, especially at that time, he was already an old man, probably in his, so that it wasn't absolutely clear which one. It had to be pointed. The Buddha had to be pointed out to King Ajatasattu who he was. So that the Buddha, both in a physical way, was a human being, and in other ways, he was born, he grew old, he got sick, he died. He had various other qualities that were, there's a very nice sutta where Ananda, the Buddha, has been sick, and he's been not able to join the community for quite some time. He's had this illness, and he's recovering from his illness, and Ananda comes out. He's delighted to see the Buddha, and he's massaging him, and Ananda sort of commenting of, how now you're getting old, you've been sick, and your skin isn't as tight as before. You're kind of loose and not the same tone of muscle. And it's just as the Buddha had a human frame, he led a human life, but he was awakened within that. Within those limitations, he was able to see the way to freedom, to awakening, and that liberation from dukkha. So it's that that being grounded within the human condition that is, to me, much more important. And as I said, historically, even in Theravada tradition, and of course in the Mahayana traditions, they go all out in the almost deifying the Buddha. But I think it's important to come back to those roots, because it is those qualities of say wisdom, of a stepping back, the possibility that we can step back from our defilements and attachments. We can live with loving kindness and compassion. We can see clearly what is suffering and what is freedom from suffering. What is fraught with ease and what is peaceful and sublime. We can experience that, and it's the Buddha's example and the Buddha's life that points the way for the rest of us. So that this recollection of the Buddha. Also, because there's stories in the in the suttas of the Buddha, say when he was still an unawakened bodhisattva, seeking liberation, practicing for awakening, that he would speaks about himself going into forests and forest shrines to practice in places that would normally bring up fear and trepidation, and he'd go out and be by himself in these places, and he'd hear it'd be nighttime, he'd hear a squirrel moving, the wind making branches, and he himself would get fearful, would experience trepidation, but then being willing to practice with that, being willing to. So one of the examples that he sets of when if he experienced fear in the sitting posture, then he would sit with that fear and work with it, investigate it, and overcome it. And he wouldn't change posture until that fear had dissipated. Or if he were walking, he were doing walking meditation, or standing, or lying down, whatever posture he was in, and that he experienced fear, and then he would stick with that. He'd investigate it, try out different things until that fear had been had dissipated, and that mood of trepidation, worry had passed. So that the Buddha had to work with the different emotions and difficulties that we all experience. But I was saying one of the things that the Buddha said was critical to his awakening, or there's two qualities. Was the effort that he kept putting in, that being willing to put forth effort, to be energetic in his training, and to keep paying attention to the ways of lifting up a certain zeal, like energy for the practice, and then say the not being content with the things that he experienced, that he knew not to be the ultimate goal, not to be the ultimate. So that because the Buddha did experience sublime states of mind, experienced great happiness. He experienced, say, honor, recognition. There's a story in the Sutta Nipata where King Bimbisara sees him and is drawn to his demeanor. There's like this is somebody who's this wanderer has something special, and he seeks him out and praises the Buddha as being. You somehow, there's something special about you, and asking the Buddha to stay in the Rajgir area, so that the king could look after him, and the Buddha not accepting it, just not being content with that acknowledgement, recognition. So whether it was external or internal, because he experienced various sublime states, but there's that honesty in his mind that was that this is not full liberation from dukkha. There's still something more to be done. There's still something more to be understood, to be relinquished, and that willingness to not settle for second best, or not be willing to be content with, say, just good enough, and so that's something that is a tremendous example for the rest of us, because it's just he's pointing out what is possible in the human condition. We can that one who applies himself can realize the fruits of this practice and this teaching. Also, the Buddha was, I say, a tremendous will and tremendous effort, but is also willing to say admit when he's got it wrong. That's the story of the Buddha. He's gone through all these incredible austerities. He's put tremendous effort into the practice. And he's got other wanderers who are with him, who are really impressed with his practice. He's obviously so sort of head and shoulders above other practitioners in some way, but still he doesn't feel he's reaped the fruits of the practice. He doesn't feel that's what the goal is about. And then just contemplating and recollecting, reflecting for himself. Well, what works, what doesn't work, what's actually should work, and then that memory of himself as a young boy with his being under the rose apple tree, and the festival going on, his father and family engaged in a festival, and he was just sitting by himself under the rose apple tree and became very peaceful, and his mind became very blissful. Experience the first absorption, meditative absorption, just a young boy, and had experienced happiness and bliss, well-being, joy of the mind settling down, and his mind going back and thinking, maybe that's the way. These austerities have not really brought fruit of thrown myself into it, and then him reflecting out loud or to himself, and maybe that is the way. And then the mind says, yeah, that's got to be the way. And then, why am I afraid of happiness and well-being that is, say, innocent and wholesome, not associated with what's unskillful or unwholesome? Why am I afraid of that? And I think there's a certain reticence in all of us to not to kind of shrink back from really giving ourselves to peace or true well-being, ease, just being able to just put things down, release and relinquish things that just clutter the mind with. There's all sorts of logic and rationality for it, whether as a worldly basis or some kind of psychological, emotional basis, but whatever. That willingness to just give ourselves to real peace and clarity. There's a shrinking back sometimes. So just to so what relying on this same insight of the Buddhas, to be willing to abide in peace and clarity and well-being that isn't tainted by desire, isn't tainted by attachment, isn't tainted by views and opinions, isn't tainted by the sense of self, the sense of me. To realize that is possible. Of course, the Buddha, again, the Buddha is the example and the one who leads the way. So as we bringing these aspects to mind, the story of the Buddha, of course his teachings but the Buddha as an archetype, one who is awakened, the Buddha as a model, the Buddha as a example of what sort of teachings would be. And of course, in the first teaching that the Buddha gives that is recorded is the teachings on the Four Noble Truths, and that is central to the whole path that the Buddha lays out to be reflecting and investigating and discerning things from the light of those Four Noble Truths. But also, I think one of the things to be recollecting in the udana, the inspired utterances of the Buddha, is what comes to mind for the Buddha, say, on his awakening. And there's a couple things that are recorded, as is in these inspired utterances, that the Buddha, recollecting the fruition of his path, and the the very first verses of the Udana, these inspired utterances. It's in Kuttaka, Pitaka, and are the recollections of the dependent origination and ita pachayata. So when this is, that is, and with the arising of this, that arises. When this isn't, that isn't. With the cessation of this, the cessation of that. So that conditionality, and then going into the principle of the dependent origination, with the dependent on ignorance as arising of mental formations, and all through this whole condition series. But it's that conditional process, cause and condition, that is it's a causal process, not in terms of say a direct causal process, but a cause and condition, and that this whole cause and conditional process is where things arise from, and they also cease. And it's as being able to reflect in terms of how those processes work and how we are, what we're contributing to it, and what can we do to step back from that, to release and relinquish that, and what we can be disenchanted from, what we can let go of. And that's where, say, the freedom from suffering arises. So that's the Buddha's first utterance. That is, this is the Buddha recollecting this, how this works, and that, because it's that being entangled in the karmic process. Because there's of course the Four Noble Truths are the most common formulation of the Buddha's teachings, and they say there is suffering, there's cause of suffering, cessation of suffering, path leading to cessation of suffering. But there's also discourses where the Buddha changes that all around. So there is kamma, there is this action. There's the origin of kamma, origin of action. There's the cessation of kamma. There's the path leading to cessation of kamma. So it's being able to see it as a process, that way we can we can understand and be free from. We can be awakened to. So these are some random recollections around the Buddhanussati, recollection of the Buddha. This is the Vesakha Puja, full moon of May, which is the commemoration of the Buddha's birth, his enlightenment, and his passing away. So that to lift those recollections up in the mind, and to I think to realize that that's also a resource for us. It's a tool that we can be relying on. That is very very traditional, very central in traditional Buddhism. So I'll offer that for reflection this evening.